Chazal teach us an idea that is very, very powerful and at the same time very difficult to grapple with. The idea is Kol man da'avid Rachmana l'tav avid. Everything that God does, He does for the good. Whatever happens, ultimately, there's an ultimate good that will come from it. And we can talk about it, but to really understand it, it's not really within our hands. Right? Like the Navi says, Lo machshivosai machshivosechem. God's thoughts are not our thoughts. We can never really fully grasp God's ways. But there are times where we know, we hear the stories, we read the stories, there's something that looks like it's going to be bad, or something that somebody has a very difficult situation, and then we see the good that comes from it. They missed the plane, and then they missed the World Trade Center. You know, the famous stories, the person doesn't get a job somewhere, and then ultimately they end up getting a job somewhere else. A different opportunity works out much better. One shidduch doesn't work out, but now a different shidduch works out. So sometimes we see the happy ending, we see how it's l'tav avid. But, as we know, there are many, many times where we don't see it. And ultimately, we don't have the answer. But we do see in this week's Parsha a really important idea, which is that even if we never experience the answer, we never witness the answer, but God's plan is so complex that there are times where the answer may come years and years later. We will only see, or we will never see, but the result, the way that it's l'tav avid, the way that it has an ultimate good, may only play out even centuries later. And the example that we see in this week's Parsha, pointed out by Rav David Feinstein, is the idea of Sarah being captured by Paro. Now we know the story of Purim. Esther gets captured by Achashverosh, captured, right? She becomes queen, she's stuck in Achashverosh's palace. Mordechai realizes that this must be for the ultimate good. He waits by the palace every day. He wants to see what's going to happen. Ultimately, he tells Esther, you know, you must have gotten this position for a good purpose. But what about Sarah? Sarah gets captured by Paro, kidnapped, taken to the palace, and Paro gets these plagues, and he ultimately lets her go, and he gives Avram lots of riches, and they come away rich. So you could say, you know, the good that came out of it was that they came away very wealthy. But Rav David Feinstein says there's perhaps more to the story here. Many, many years later, when the Jewish people are traveling in the Midbar, in the desert, Moshe is commanded to count the Jewish people. And when he counts them, so the way that he says it is, for example, he says to the family of Chanoch l'Chanoch, Mishpachas ha-Chanochi. And to Falu, Mishpachas ha-Falui. When he lists each family, he says the name of the family, and then he says ha-Chanochi, and he puts a hey at the beginning and a yud at the end. And Rashi tells us that the reason why there's a hey at the beginning of each family name and a yud at the end is because the nations of the world were challenging the lineage of the Jewish people. You're trying to list your tribes. You're saying that these children are the children of these men. Are you serious? You were slaves in Egypt. Your bodies were enslaved to the Egyptians. Do you think that your women weren't also enslaved? Do you think that your lineage is really, that the people you think are the fathers are really the fathers? Come on. The Egyptians had their way with the Jewish women. That's what the nations of the world were saying. And to that the Torah testifies, Hashem testifies, He puts His name, He puts a hey and a yud and a hey surrounding each name to say that this is true. This is the lineage that the Egyptians did not take advantage of the Jewish women in Mitzrayim. And it's bewildering. Why not? How could that be? How could it be that they didn't take advantage? Explains Rav David Feinstein, because every Egyptian remembered what had happened to Paro. Years earlier, Paro had captured a Hebrew woman, Sarah. And look what happened to him. He got all these plagues. It was a terrible ending for him. The Egyptians remembered this. They remembered the story, and even hundreds of years later, it was part of their history, part of what they taught their children, stay away from the Jewish women. And so even though when they enslaved the Jewish people, they made them suffer in all kinds of ways, they left the Jewish women alone. So years later, Hashem's master plan was realized. But of course, Sarah at the time couldn't have known what would happen, why this was happening to her. And so perhaps this can give us strength, this can help us when we face a difficult situation. We don't know. We don't have the answer. We may never discover the answer. It could be nobody will ever discover the answer. Sometimes you need someone with the insight of Rav David Feinstein to see the connection, amazing connection that he makes. We may never make the connection. But we have to remember, God's thoughts are not our thoughts. God's ideas are not our ideas. We don't understand necessarily the ways of God, but we can appreciate the idea of Kol Man Da'avid Rachmana L'Tav Avid. Whatever God does is for the best. We have to realize God has a master plan, and that ultimately what happens is for an ultimate good. Have a wonderful Shabbos.